Hello folks, welcome back to the channel. Tonight, I have a story that will make you question whether a simple joke can truly remain harmless. A tale of friendship tested in a place more remote and more menacing than any of us ever dreamed possible. Prepare yourselves for a journey where laughter turns dark, trust is shattered, and the very shadows themselves seem to whisper warnings. Let's dive into the nightmare. It all started as a simple joke. Isn't that often how things go wrong? You think something is just silly fun until suddenly it's not anymore. Looking back, I see all the little warning signs we brushed aside. But at the time, my friends and I were just trying to have a good weekend. I guess you could say we asked for trouble without realizing it. Last summer, 4 of my closest friends, Eric, Ryan, Mia, and Jess, and I decided we needed a break from everyday life. We piled into Eric's old, squeaky SUV, stuffed with camping gear, snacks, and a big supply of cheap beer. The plan was simple: find a cabin in the woods, turn off our phones, and spend a carefree weekend away from everything that stressed us out. The ride out to the cabin was actually a lot of fun. Ryan, the group's self-appointed comedian, cracked non-stop jokes and did silly impressions of horror movie villains. Eric, who was always the most responsible, kept rolling his eyes at Ryan, but he had a grin on his face the whole time. Mia and Jess sat in the back, singing along to random songs on the radio and teasing Ryan for his over-the-top humor. As for me, I was just glad to be there, soaking up the easy closeness of friends who know each other so well. Our cabin was perfect in the most isolated way possible: no internet, no phone signal, and the closest neighbor was a mile down a bumpy road, surrounded by towering pines and oak trees. The wooden cabin felt like it was part of the forest. At night, the sky was so clear and the stars were so bright that it almost looked fake, like someone had painted them across black velvet. On our first evening, we sat around a crackling campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing old ghost stories we remembered from childhood. It was spooky, but we laughed off the fear. That changed on the second day, when everything started going very wrong. We decided to take a hike to a nearby lake we had heard about from the cabin's owner. The path was overgrown, but we could still follow it pretty well as it weaved through clusters of giant trees and patches of vibrant wildflowers. Ryan, of course, kept wandering off the trail anytime something caught his eye, a strange mushroom or an odd rock formation. It was one of these little detours that led us to an old graveyard we didn't even know existed. It came out of nowhere. One moment, we were surrounded by tall green trees, and the next, we found ourselves in a clearing with faded tombstones poking out of the ground. The whole place felt colder, almost like the air was heavier there. It was so quiet, I realized I hadn't heard a single bird since we stepped inside. "Okay, this is officially creepy," Mia said, her voice just above a whisper. Ryan, on the other hand, was thrilled. "Creepy? This is awesome. It's like we're in some low-budget horror movie, right?" He let out a theatrical evil laugh. The headstones were old and crumbling, so weathered that we couldn't read most names or dates. A few stones leaned at odd angles, as if the earth was ready to swallow them. But one grave in particular stood out. This tombstone looked almost brand new, with the inscription carved in clear letters. "Here lies Thomas Whitaker, who laughed himself to death." Ryan, naturally, burst into giggles. "You can't be serious. Someone wrote that on a gravestone?" He bent over, pretending to laugh so hard he couldn't breathe. What could possibly be that funny? I'll admit, I laughed too. We all did. It felt so strange and silly to see that in the middle of a place like this. Mia snapped a photo of the headstone, and Eric and Jess pretended to reenact, dying of laughter. But Ryan went for the big performance. He fell dramatically on the ground, clutching his stomach and gasping for air like he was in some comedy show. "Oh no," he gasped. "I'm laughing too hard. Someone save me." That's when we realized we weren't alone. An old man stood at the edge of the graveyard, staring at us. None of us had seen him coming. He was tall, with a wrinkled face and tired eyes that seemed to see right through us. He wore a worn-out flannel and dusty jeans. There was something about him, maybe the way he stood so still, that sent a chill down my spine. "Show some respect for the dead," he said in a low, raspy voice. "Do not laugh at their fate." It was like someone hit the pause button on our group. We all went quiet. After a tense moment, Ryan tried to smile, but it looked forced. "Sorry, man," he said. "We were just joking around." The old man didn't respond. He just kept staring, then slowly shook his head and walked off into the trees, disappearing as silently as he'd arrived. No one said much on the way back to the cabin. We felt uneasy, and we couldn't quite explain why. It was just one strange encounter, right? But the fun vibe was gone. Even Ryan, who usually joked about everything, seemed a bit shaken. By the time we got back, the sun was setting, bathing the wooden cabin in dim orange light. It should have been pretty, but for some reason, it made me feel uneasy. We dumped our backpacks on the porch and went inside without talking. Later that night, we gathered around a small fire pit outside, each of us holding a beer, trying to get back that relaxed vacation feeling. Eric tossed another log onto the fire, sending glowing sparks into the air. "All right," he said, trying to sound cheerful. "We came here to have fun. How about some ghost stories to set the mood? Good or bad idea?" Mia groaned. "Really? After today? Why not?" Ryan chimed in, some of his old spirit returning. "Don't tell me that old man freaked you out." "Mia," Jess shrugged. "He was weird, sure, but maybe he was just a local trying to scare off outsiders. People can be protective of abandoned places." That broke the tension a bit, and we started sharing the most cliché ghost stories we could think of. We piled on dramatic voices and made fun of each other's wild gestures. By the time it got around to Ryan's turn, we were actually laughing again. It felt good to shake off the unease we'd been carrying since the graveyard. Ryan stood up, acting like a narrator on a stage. "I have the perfect story," he declared. "Ever hear about Thomas Whitaker, the guy who laughed himself to death?" Mia groaned again, but a grin tugged at her lips. The rest of us chuckled. Ryan cleared his throat and raised his arms in a theatrical way. "Thomas Whitaker still roams the forest at night, looking for people to share that ultimate joke with. But if you hear him laugh..." He never got to finish. A quiet chuckle floated out from the dark trees just beyond the firelight. So faint we almost missed it. We all froze, each of us holding our breath. "Not funny, Ryan," Jess warned, though her voice shook slightly. Ryan looked worried. "I swear, that's not me." The laugh came again, louder this time, sounding like someone was struggling to breathe between giggles. It echoed around us, sending goosebumps across my arms. We tried to play it off. Maybe it was just an animal or another group of hikers nearby. But that night, after we went indoors, the laughter continued. It circled the cabin, sometimes close, sometimes far, but always there. And when we woke up in the morning, Ryan was gone. At first, we didn't freak out. Ryan was known for sneaking around to set up pranks or wandering off for an early morning walk. But when we checked around the cabin, calling for him, there was no sign of Ryan anywhere. His phone was still in his room, which was strange. Ryan never went anywhere without it. The woods outside felt oddly silent. No birds, no wind, just stillness. Maybe he went down to the lake, Eric suggested, trying to be logical. He probably got bored and wanted to explore. We searched the lake area, the surrounding trees, but found no trace of him. As the hours went by, worry settled over us. By late afternoon, we were all back at the cabin, pacing around, trying to figure out what to do. That's when we heard a phone buzzing from the living room. Mia went to investigate and found Ryan's phone, except now it was lying on the coffee table, with the screen lit up, showing the gallery of photos. None of us had touched it. Mia picked up the phone, her hands shaking. "Who put this here?" she whispered. We all swore we hadn't touched Ryan's phone. Then Mia's face went pale. "There's a new photo." She showed it to us. It was Ryan, lying on the cabin floor with a giant grin stretched across his face. His eyes looked hollow, not focused on anything we could see. The picture was time-stamped from earlier that day, when we were out searching for him. Jess let out a cry. Stepping back in horror, Eric took the phone and scrolled. But that was the only photo. No clues, just that disturbing image. The lights suddenly flickered and went out, plunging us into total darkness. That's when the laughter started again, echoing through the cabin's rooms. It was low, wheezy, and felt like it was right next to us no matter which way we turned. My body froze as the wrongness of it washed over me. I could see Jess trembling, Eric gripping a fireplace poker with white knuckles, Mia backing into a corner. None of us knew what to do. Somehow, we made it through the night, each of us terrified that the laughter might grow closer at any second. At one point, we heard 3 slow knocks at the front door, followed by footsteps circling the cabin. A voice that sounded exactly like Ryan's called out to us, telling us to open up, but we knew it couldn't be him. When the footsteps finally moved away, we were too scared to investigate. We just stayed in one room together, quietly waiting for dawn. As soon as the sun rose, we rushed out of the cabin to the car, trying to escape. The walk felt endless, and we kept looking over our shoulders, half expecting to see some grinning figure lurking behind a tree. But we made it to the SUV, loaded our stuff as fast as we could, and jumped in. Eric started the engine, and we drove off, hoping that would be the end of it. For a while, we almost believed it would be. The mood in the car was grim, but there was a faint sense of relief. We told ourselves that once we reached the nearest police station, we'd explain everything and they'd help us look for Ryan. Maybe they'd find a rational answer, one that didn't involve ghostly laughter or twisted smiles. As the sky grew darker, the roads turned narrower, and the trees seemed to press closer around us. Tension built up again. Then something smashed into the windshield with a loud thud. We screamed as a pale face appeared against the glass, its wide grin pressed flat. Black eyes stared right at us without blinking. Eric hit the gas, and the figure peeled off the windshield, falling behind. But when I looked back, it was already standing, head tilted, grin still etched into its face. None of us dared to speak for a long time. Eventually, the GPS told us to take another turn onto a poorly maintained road with cracks and weeds. That's when we heard laughter again, low, scratchy at first, then growing into a chorus of mocking giggles. Something darted past the car, so fast we couldn't see it clearly. Then we saw a massive fallen tree blocking the road ahead. Eric tried to reverse, but the engine sputtered and died. As we sat there, trying to figure out what to do, our headlights shone on something by the tree trunk. Ryan, lying on the ground, face frozen in a strange, serene grin. We ran out to help him, but he was cold to the touch. We hurried back to the car, locked the doors, and desperately tried to start the engine again. Nothing worked. Suddenly, Ryan's body was gone. The laughter outside the car grew loud and overwhelming, like it was taunting us. We had no choice but to call the police. When they arrived, there was no body to be found at all, just Ryan's cracked phone, which still showed that horrible photo of his lifeless grin. The police were polite but skeptical. They brought us in for questioning, and we told them everything. They couldn't find Ryan or any proof of what we said, except the phone. In the end, they let us go. We felt more lost than ever. We scattered to our own homes, each of us shaken beyond belief. Eric tried to pretend it was all behind us. Mia cried quietly, refusing to talk much about it. Jess stayed distant, answering only with short texts that said, "I'm okay." I tried to talk to friends outside our group, looking for help or comfort, but no one really believed the story. They wanted rational explanations. Maybe we got spooked by an animal, or maybe Ryan had some mental break and ran off. But none of it matched what we saw, what we heard. That was when I realized none of us were safe. Late that evening, as I sat alone in my living room, exhausted but unable to sleep, there was a knock at my door. A familiar voice said, "Hey, it's Mia, let me in." I rushed to the door, relieved, but when I opened it, I found Jess standing there instead, wearing a perfectly casual smile. Before I could say anything, she stepped inside. Her back was to me, arms hanging at her sides, head tilted as though she was listening for something. When she turned around, her face wore that impossible grin again, stretching too wide, her eyes empty. In that moment, I knew the same thing that happened to Ryan had happened to her, and maybe to Eric and Mia too. That grin grew bigger and bigger, filling my whole vision. I thought about running, but my legs wouldn't move. Panic hit me as I finally understood that none of this was over, that the thing wearing Jess's face had come for me now. And that, dear viewers, is where the real nightmare began.